It's a huge pleasure for me to talk to you about the Beatles, a band that wrote the soundtrack of the 60s, that split up in 1970, never to reform again. And there's no better place to talk about the Beatles than here in Heerlen. Because, of course, it was here in Heerlen where the Beatles performed when they came here on their first world tour back in 1964. And when you were a teenager in those days, you might remember the excitement in the newspapers, writing about the coming of the Beatles. Beatles in Heerlen. Het Limburgs Dagblad had all the details. The Beatles would come here early in the afternoon, do a sound check, give away some free autographs, and later on would be on their way to Kerkrade and eventually to Utrecht. Strangely enough, we don't have any footage of the Beatles' visit to Heerlen. Why was their visit never recorded? Because, of course, it never happened. If you take a closer look at the date on which this article was published, you'll see that it was April the 1st, 1964, April Fool's Day. Unfortunately for the Limburg fans of the Beatles, they never came here, although they did visit Amsterdam 2 months later. The editors of het Limburgs Dagblad tapped nicely into the madness that captured the media in the first half of 1964. The sudden rise of the Beatles had started at the end of 1963, and soon the Beatles were everywhere. This sudden rise of the fame of the Beatles soon became an object of doubt and even cynicism. We had seen so many times that an artist had emerged from nowhere, scored a few hits, and then silently disappeared from the scene. Of course, the same would happen to the Beatles. So one question that the Beatles were endlessly asked in these months and these years actually was, when will the bubble burst? As if they had a crystal ball in which they could see their own expiration date. When will the bubble burst? That might be the question that my family and friends also ask them. In these photos, I am 15 years old and paying a visit to the Beatles' birthplace, Liverpool, for the first time in my life, here at Penny Lane and later on at the gates of Strawberry Field. In my room, their music was always on. I read every single book that I could lay my hands on and taped every single second that I saw of the Beatles on television. And my friends and family and my classmates, well, I can imagine that having such a fanatical Beatles fan in their midst caused doubt and maybe even irritation. When will this guy's bubble burst? When will his Beatles madness be over? Because it's true. Besides my parents and my sister, the Beatles were simply always there, like a fifth family member. The question, when will the bubble burst, was also asked to the Beatles themselves in an interview that they gave at the end of 1963. Paul McCartney answered that he could not imagine himself singing songs like From Me to You as an old man of 40. At 40, he said, we may not even know how to write songs anymore. And Ringo Starr famously added that when his days as a Beatles drummer would be over, he would like to start a string of lady hairdressers' saloons. Unfortunately for Ringo, a career as a hair salon owner would never follow. And when Paul McCartney was an old man of 40, he was still singing Beatles songs and scoring worldwide hits that he had written himself. In short, that Beatles bubble, it never burst. As for me, I developed my own passion doing scientific research. In 2010, I obtained my PhD on a book with 10 propositions, one of which was, of course, about the Beatles. I continued to do research and finally managed to realize my ambition to become a professor here at the Open Universiteit. But today, let's not talk about science. Let's talk about the Beatles, because as I said, the Beatles bubble, it never burst. Next month, I will be going to London to see Paul McCartney live for the 10th time in my life. Is it normal for a fan to go to London to be able to say, in essence, I was in the same room with a former Beatle? Well, not for many things, many regular fans. But fans like me, extreme fans, they do this kind of thing. And there are many, tens of thousands of Beatles fans like me all over the world. Men and women with special Beatles rooms in their homes. And often with their own kind of Beatles specialism, whether it's collecting Beatles bootleg records, collecting Beatles dolls, or everything that's related to the Beatles movies. In America, there is even a fan who has collected more than 3,000 copies of one and the same Beatles album, the White Album, an album with an all-white cover and a small number in the right-hand corner. And I totally understand this guy. What does a fan like me do when he meets a fellow Beatles fan? First of all, I will ask you some simple questions to check if you're a regular fan or a diehard fan. If you're a regular fan, I will kindly smile at you and give away some nice chit-chat. But it's meeting a diehard fan that is something else. This will make the heartbeat faster. It will make a twinkle appear in our eyes. Soon we will forget everything around us and will want to do nothing but talk, and talk again about the Beatles. And talking about the Beatles became my specialism, because in 2013 I started my own podcast on the Beatles called Fab4Cast, together with jan-cees and Wiebo Dijksma. With some goodwill, you could say that I have found my own Beatles, just like John, Paul, George, and Ringo found each other, but all with our own knowledge of the Beatles, our own sense of humor, and our own passion about the group. In 2023, we recorded our 200th podcast, and we are currently clocking in at number 226. You could call it a hobby that has got out of hand, but we don't see it that way. It's not like a hobby, but more like a way of looking at the world, maybe even a way of life. So what do we talk about when we talk about the Beatles in our podcast? For example, Beatlemania in Indonesia, South Africa, and China. George Harrison and his love for the ukulele. The Beatles and artificial intelligence. The use of ooh, ah, and other wordless vocals in the music of the Beatles. So many interesting topics. Yet, there can hardly be a bigger difference than between being a Beatles fan in 1988, when it all started for me, and 2024. First of all, technique has allowed us to hear the Beatles in totally new ways. Artificial intelligence has allowed us to hear sounds in the music of the Beatles that we have never heard before, like discovering new layers of paint in a painting by Van Gogh. So, as the years progress and we grow older, it sometimes feels as if the Beatles even become closer to us. Secondly, I'm not that 15-year-old boy anymore. Growing older, you understand the world better. And this means that I also understand the Beatles and their lives better. Yes, it's still mainly about those 215 songs, but it's about so much more. It's about their personalities and how they brought out the best in each other, about their influence on other bands and our influence on our whole culture. Even after all these years, the Beatles continue to amaze us. Let me just give one more example of that. I just said that I wanted to talk about the Beatles and not about science. But in actual fact, it's impossible to separate the Beatles from science. All over the world, scientists like to quote the Beatles in the titles of their publications. And the most popular example of this is the song The Long and Winding Road. A search on Google Scholar points out that there are almost 24,000 publications which quote this Beatles song. Why the long and winding road? Well, of course, because doing scientific research often is a long and winding road. There is no better way to express this than by quoting this song of the Beatles. Now, let's go back to the beginning for a moment, to Paul McCartney as a young kid of 21 who said that he would not like to sing, who said that he could not imagine singing songs like From Me to You as an old man of 40. 10 years later, in 1973, he had become a lot wiser.
I always used to think, when I was about 16, I used to think, well, 25 is the end. Because when you reach 25, you don't feel old. And you think, well, maybe 35 is where I can go to. When you reach 35, you start to think, well, maybe 45 is feasible, you know. So these days, I figured that there's no reason why I couldn't go on till I drop.
Who doesn't recognize this? You grow older, and as you've reached a certain age, you suddenly don't feel that old at all. In 1963, Paul McCartney was too young to realize this. This also means that it was only by growing older myself that I understood how young the Beatles were when they wrote those amazing songs, but also, tragically, how young John Lennon was when he was murdered in New York City in 1980, only 40 years old. And now look at this. George Harrison released this solo album in 1970, All Things Must Pass. And as a young kid of 15, I looked at this picture with amazement and could only think, what an old man. It only later dawned on me that George in this picture is actually 27 years old, which makes the lyrics on this album all the more remarkable. And now look at this. In 1987, Paul McCartney released a compilation album called All the Best. And at the back of the CD booklet was an overview of all the albums that he had released so far. And as a brand new fan, I put a little cross above every album until I had them all. It was all about the music. When I look at this collection now, I see something else. I see a life. I see a man who loves his wife, who gets married, who becomes a father, who finds joy in the ordinary, but also someone who sings about losing those dear to him, and in the end even sings about the inevitable end of his own life in 2007 in the song The End of the End. So here we are in 2024. Being a Beatles fan has brought me so much pleasure and so many insights. But can there also be a downside to being a big Beatles fan? Well, having all the knowledge about the Beatles can actually ruin the spontaneous enjoyment of their songs. Let me give an example. In many Beatles books you will read that the recording process of the song Maxwell's Silver Hammer was a drag. So this has become the new narrative. On their last masterpiece, Abbey Road, there's one song that everybody hated except for Paul McCartney. The song was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Having this knowledge about the recording process can influence the way that we listen to a song. And that can be a pity. So what I sometimes try is to apply a little trick. How did I enjoy the song when I first heard it? Well, I know one thing for sure. When I first heard Maxwell's Silver Hammer on the Abbey Road album, it never struck me as a bad song, and I always sang along with it very happily. So that's what I sometimes try, to turn on the child in me again, and to listen with ears not yet tainted by all those piles of literature. Being such a big Beatles fan also begs the question, what would my life be like without the Beatles? You might have seen the film Yesterday. In this film, this exact question is explored, because it starts from the fantastic premise that from one day to the next, no one in the world knows the songs of the Beatles anymore, except for our main character. Yes, the Earth still keeps spinning, but we also see the main character slowly going mad as he tries to make the Beatles songs world famous as soon as possible. What would my life be like without the Beatles? That's a hard question. Not having the Beatles would mean not having my friends of Fab4Cast and not having our fabulous listeners. It would mean not having a backbone in my life, a frame of reference, and even a beacon in these very bleak political times. Surely there must be some other kinds of frame of reference, although I honestly wouldn't know what. Well, or maybe I do. A few weeks ago, I visited the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And I read on the wall that Van Gogh decided to become a painter when he was 27 years old. He did not know if he had any talent, but he studied hard to learn the job and followed his instinct. He absorbed the influence of other painters of his time and finally died 10 years later to become a world-famous painter shortly after his death. And it's stories like this that always fascinate me. The talent which just has to come out, the ease with which some people can create masterpieces. The pushing of boundaries because that comes naturally to you. So finding a similar art figure with the same kind of talent would probably be what I would start looking for. Which brings me to the end. What I hope that you will take with you tonight is not that you have to become a Beatles fan. I did not come here to convert you. I hope that you will have your own Beatles, your own passion. Your passion might become a benchmark for you, like the Beatles are for me. Fortunately, there are no rules here. It can be anything. It can be like growing the best potato, taking care of your horse, running a marathon, cycling. Anything goes. It's just like John Lennon said in a song, "All You Need Is Love," there's nothing you can do that can't be done. So this is where my story ends. And if I chit-chat with you in a few moments' time, it will not be because I'm testing what kind of Beatles fan you are. It will be because I enjoy talking to you and like to hear about your passions. Thank you.